Chapter 1. A plant bore history the world before written records. There is a plant that has been with us longer than our oldest cities, longer than our first written words, longer, perhaps, than our very concept of civilization itself. It grew wild across the steppes of Central Asia, its slender green leaves swaying in winds that crossed a world still untouched by the hand-organized humanity. Long before anyone built a temple, long before anyone scratched symbols into clay or chiseled stories into stone, this plant was already part of the human story. Its name, in the modern scientific language we have given it, is cannabis sativa. But the names it has carried across thousands of years and dozens of languages would fill a book of their own. To understand when humans first began using cannabis, not just as a textile fiber or a source of food, but as a substance that altered the mind, we must travel back to a time that lives not in written records, but in archaeological soil, in fossilized pollen, in the chemical residue left inside ancient burial urns, and in the genetic memory of a plant that has followed our kind across continents and centuries. The story of cannabis and humanity is not a story of discovery. It is a story of encounter, a slow, evolving relationship between two species, one plant and one primate, whose lives became intertwined in ways that neither could have anticipated, and that neither has ever fully untangled. The origins of cannabis. A botanical history. Cannabis is native to Central Asia. The best scientific evidence points to the region encompassing modern-day China, Mongolia, southern Siberia, and the mountainous areas stretching into present-day Kazakhstan and Afghanistan as the original homeland of the plant. Botanical and genetic studies published in the 21st century have traced the evolutionary origins of cannabis to this broad Central Asian corridor, where the wild ancestor of the domesticated plant still grows today in patches of uncultivated land. The plant is remarkably adaptable. It grows in poor soils, survives harsh winters, and reaches maturity in a single growing season. This hardiness is likely part of what made it so valuable to early human populations, who were not yet farmers in any modern sense, but were skilled observers of the natural world, intimately familiar with the plants that surrounded them, perpetually searching for those that could be useful. Cannabis belongs to the family Cannabaceae and exists in several species, most notably Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica, though botanists continue to debate how strictly these divisions should be drawn. What is clear is that even in antiquity, humans recognized distinctions within the plant, noting that certain varieties produced stronger fibers, while others produced more potent psychoactive effects. This was not science in the way we would recognize it today. It was accumulated observation, passed down through generations of practical experience. The plant produces a unique class of chemical compounds known as cannabinoids, of which tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, is the most famous. THC binds to receptors in the human brain, ways that alter perception, mood, and consciousness. This is not an accident of nature. The plant did not develop these compounds for the benefit of the humans who would eventually seek them out. THC and the other cannabinoids evolved as a form of chemical defense, protecting the plant from insects, pathogens, and ultraviolet radiation. That they happen to interact so profoundly with the human nervous system is one of the great coincidences, or perhaps convergences, of natural history. The first encounter, no one can say with certainty when the first human encountered the psychoactive properties of cannabis. The moment was never recorded. There was no witness who set down the experience in words, no archaeologist who was present to catalog what happened. What we have instead are educated inferences drawn from archaeological evidence, from the biology of the plant, and from what we know of human behavior in the ancient world. The most likely scenario, proposed by several ethnobotanists and historians of ancient religion, is that the first psychoactive use of cannabis was accidental. Early humans living in Central Asia, perhaps as hunter-gatherers or as the earliest proto-pastoral societies, would have encountered the plant in the wild. They might have burned it as part of larger fires, for warmth, for cooking, for clearing land, and noticed the effects of the smoke. Or they might have consumed seeds and leaves as food, and noticed a change in their mental state. Or perhaps they observed animals being strangely after consuming the plant, and drew connections that led them to experiment themselves. Whatever the precise mechanism of that first encounter, the relationship that followed would span millennia, cross continents, inspire religions, fuel trade networks, shape laws, launch wars, and ultimately become one of the most politically charged botanical topics in modern human history. Chapter 2:0. The archaeological reading the past through chemistry and soil archaeology does not give us dates. It gives us estimates. It gives us windows of probability, ranges measured in decades or centuries, constrained by the methods available to us and the accidents of preservation. When we say that humans were using cannabis 10,000 years ago, we mean that the evidence points strongly in that direction. But we hold that statement with the measured confidence of scientists who understand both what the data show and what it cannot tell us. The oldest direct evidence for cannabis use comes from East Asia, and specifically from the territory of what is now China. Archaeological sites in this region have yielded cannabis seeds, fibers, and pollen dating back to the Neolithic period. The Late Stone Age, roughly 10,000 to 5,000 years before the Common Era. At some of these sites, cannabis seeds appear to have been used for food, pressed for oil, or used in ritual contexts. But fiber use and food use are not the same as intentional psychoactive use. Hemp, the low THC variety of cannabis, can produce useful fiber and nutritious seeds without ever inducing a high. The question that archaeologists and historians have wrestled with for decades is not merely whether ancient people knew about cannabis, but specifically whether and when they began using it for its mind-altering properties. The Yonghai Tomiz, a pivotal discovery in 2008. A team of researchers published findings that would become one of the most cited pieces of evidence in the history of cannabis scholarship. They had been analyzing materials recovered from the Yonghai tombs in the Turpan Basin of northwestern China, a region that sits at the western edge of ancient Chinese civilization and at the crossroads of Central Asian cultures. The tombs dated to approximately 2,700 years ago, placing them in historians call the Late Bronze Age or Early Iron Age in this part of the world. Inside one of the tombs, the researchers found a remarkable cache of cannabis, nearly 800 grams of the plant material, carefully deposited alongside the body of a man who appeared to be a shaman or ritual specialist. The cannabis was not in the form of seeds or fiber. It had been placed, deliberately and in substantial quantity, as what the researchers concluded was almost certainly material intended for ritualistic or medicinal use. Chemical analysis of the plant material revealed the presence of cannabinoids, confirming that this not industrial hemp, but a psychoactive variety of the plant. The Yonghai discovery was significant not because it was the oldest evidence of cannabis use in Central Asia, but because of what it told us about how the plant was being used. The deliberate inclusion of cannabis in a burial context, alongside a figure who appears to have occupied a specialized social role, strongly suggests that by 700 BCE, cannabis was already deeply embedded in the spiritual and healing practices of the people of this region. This was not the first time anyone had smoked or consumed cannabis. By the time these tombs were sealed, the practice almost certainly had centuries or millennia of history behind it. Scythians and the ritual smoke bath, perhaps the most vivid and specific description of cannabis use in the ancient world, comes not from an archaeological find, but from a text. A text written in the 5th century BCE by the Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled widely through the ancient world, recorded his observations with a reporter's eye for detail. Herodotus describes a people he calls the Scythians, nomadic horse warriors of the Eurasian steppe, who roamed the vast grasslands stretching from the Black Sea to Central Asia. The Scythians were among the most powerful and feared peoples of their age, known for their skill in mounted warfare, their elaborate gold work, and their ferocious independence. They were also, according to Herodotus, enthusiastic users of cannabis. In his histories, Herodotus describes what he calls a purification ritual performed by the Scythians after a burial ceremony. The mourners, he writes, enter small structures and place hemp seeds, he uses the Greek word for hemp, on red-hot stones inside the tent. The seeds smolder and produce a dense smoke, and the people inside cry out with pleasure as they inhale it. Herodotus describes this as a form of cleansing, but his account makes it clear that the effects were intoxicating. For centuries, scholars were uncertain whether to take Herodotus literally. He was a storyteller as much as a historian, and his accounts of foreign peoples sometimes reflected Greek stereotypes and exaggerations as much as direct observation. But in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, a series of remarkable archaeological discoveries in the Eurasian steppe would validate his account in striking detail. Excavations of Scythian burial mounds, known as kurgans, yielded objects that matched the description of the smoking apparatus Herodotus had described. Metal braziers, tent stakes, and vessels containing the charred remains of cannabis seeds were found at multiple sites across the region. The chemical signature of THC was identified in some of these residues. Herodotus, writing 25 centuries ago, had not been making things up. The Pazyryk culture and the Siberian evidence in the high altitudes of the Altai Mountains, where Russia, China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan meet. The cold of the permafrost has preserved organic materials that would otherwise have rotted away thousands of years ago. The Pazyryk culture, a group closely related to the Scythians, left behind burial mounds in this region that have yielded extraordinary finds. Beautifully preserved textiles, leather goods, wooden furniture, and the frozen bodies of their occupants, complete with elaborate tattoos. Among the finds from Pazyryk burial sites are braziers and smoking vessels with clear signs of cannabis use. Coriander seeds and cannabis were found together in several tombs, suggesting that both plants played roles in ritual practice. The evidence from the Altai region, combined with the Scythian accounts and the Yanghai tomb findings, paints a consistent picture. Cannabis used for ritual and psychoactive purposes was widespread across the Eurasian steppe at least 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, and probably much earlier. Chapter 3. Cannabis in Ancient China, the oldest civilization, and the hemp plant. China holds the distinction of having one of the longest documented relationships with cannabis of any civilization on Earth. The Chinese character for hemp is one of the oldest plant names in the written record of East Asia, appearing in oracle bone inscriptions that date back more than 3,000 years. But the relationship between Chinese civilization and cannabis stretches back much further than the written word. The earliest evidence of cannabis cultivation in China comes from the Neolithic period, Archaeological sites in the Yellow River Valley and along the eastern coast of China have yielded cannabis seeds and fiber cordage that date to as early as 10,000 BCE. At this point in human history, the agricultural revolution was either just beginning or had not yet occurred at all in most parts of the world. The people who left these traces of cannabis were among the earliest human populations to engage in any form of deliberate plant cultivation. What were they using it for? Primarily, at this earliest stage, for fiber. The strong, durable fibers of the hemp plant were ideal for making rope, cloth, and fishing nets. Technologies that would have been invaluable to populations living in river valleys and along coastlines. Cannabis seeds were also eaten, providing a nutritious source of protein and essential fatty acids. In the material record of early China, cannabis was first and foremost a utilitarian plant. The Pen Cao Cao Qing and medical cannabis, the transition from utilitarian use to medicinal and potentially psychoactive use in China is documented in what is probably the oldest pharmacological text in human history. The Pen Tian Cao Qing, or the classic of herbal medicine. This text is attributed to the legendary Emperor Shennong, the divine farmer, who is said to have lived around 2700 BCE. In its written form, the text dates to approximately the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, but it is believed to codify knowledge that had been passed down orally for thousands of years before that. The Pen Tisao Qing describe as mefen, the flowering tops of the cannabis plant, as a medicinal substance with powerful properties. The text notes that in large doses, cannabis can produce visions and communicate with spirits, and it cautions against excessive use for this reason. In smaller doses, it is recommended for a range of conditions including rheumatic pain, malaria, constipation, and mental disorders. The text thus explicitly acknowledges both the psychoactive and the medicinal dimensions of the plant, an acknowledgement that would not become fully accepted in Western medicine for another 2,000 years. What is remarkable about this early Chinese pharmacological tradition is not just that it recognized cannabis as a psychoactive substance, but that it attempted to codify appropriate versus inappropriate use. The Pen Tisao Qing does not celebrate intoxication. It frames cannabis as a powerful medicine that requires careful handling. This reflects a broader Chinese philosophical tradition that viewed intoxicants with ambivalence, acknowledging their power while cautioning against excess. Taoist ritual and cannabis. In the centuries around the birth of the Common Era, cannabis found a significant role in certain strands of Taoist practice in China. Some Taoist alchemists and ritual specialists used cannabis as part of their pursuit of immortality and spiritual transcendence. The great preoccupations of early Taoism. Cannabis was sometimes included in incense mixtures burned during rituals, and it was associated with the ability to communicate with spirits and to see beyond the ordinary world of appearances. This ritual use of cannabis in Chinese Taoism represents an interesting convergence with what we see in the Scythian and Central Asian traditions. Across a broad band of Eurasia, from the steppes of the north to the river valleys of eastern China, cannabis appears to have occupied a similar cultural niche. A plant associated with ritual, with altered states of consciousness, and with the boundary between the human world and the world of spirits. Whether this convergence, a single cultural tradition that spread across the continent, or independent discoveries of the same plant's properties, is a question that historians and archaeologists continue to debate. Chapter 4: Cannabis, Ancient India and the Vedic Tradition. Soma Bang and the Sacred Plant. No culture in the ancient world developed a more elaborate, more enduring, or more spiritually sophisticated relationship with cannabis than the civilization of the Indian subcontinent. In India, cannabis, known as bhang in its mildest form, ganja as the dry flowering tops, and karas as the concentrated resin, is not merely a plant or a drug, is a divine gift, a sacred substance, a medicine, a sacrament, and a companion on the path toward liberation. Its use in India stretches back to the beginnings of recorded history and continues, essentially unchanged in its spiritual significance, to the present day. The story begins with the Vedas, the old scriptures of what would become Hinduism, composed in Sanskrit and transmitted orally for centuries before being written down, with origins that may reach back 3,500 years or more. The Vedas describe a sacred drink called soma, which was consumed in elaborate rituals by priests and is described as conferring divine insight, healing, and connection with the gods. The identity of soma has been one of the great mysteries ancient religious scholarship, with various researchers proposing that it was derived from the Amanita muscaria mushroom, the ephedra plant, or, according to some scholars, cannabis. The debate over soma's identity has never been definitively resolved. But what is beyond dispute is that the Atharva Veda, one of the 4 Vedic texts, explicitly names cannabis as one of 5 sacred plants and describes as a source of happiness, a liberator from anxiety, and a gift from the god Shiva. This is one of the earliest and clearest textual descriptions of cannabis as a psychoactive substance with spiritual significance. And it places that recognition firmly within one of the oldest surviving religious traditions in human history. Shiva and the hemp devotion in the Hindu tradition, the god Shiva, the destroyer, the transformer, the lord of yoga, has a special and intimate association with cannabis. Legend holds that Shiva discovered the plant and became so enamored of its properties that he made it his food. His devotees, known as Shaivites, have for millennia consumed bhang as a form of communion with their god, a way of accessing the divine consciousness that Shiva represents. On the festival of Mahashivaratri, the great night of Shiva, bhang-infused drinks are consumed by millions of devotees across India as a sacred act. This is not a minor or peripheral tradition within Hinduism. The association between Shiva and cannabis is as central and as ancient as any aspect of Hindu religious practice. Sadhus, Hindu holy men who have renounced worldly life in pursuit of spiritual liberation, have used cannabis as part of their practice for centuries, viewing its consumption not as self-indulgence, but as a form of yoga, a method of dissolving the ego and approaching the formless divine. The spiritual framework that ancient Indian culture built around cannabis is one of the most sophisticated attempts any civilization has made to integrate a psychoactive plant into a coherent religious and ethical system, rather than prohibiting the plant or treating its effects as dangerous. The Hindu tradition sought to understand and harness those effects, embedding them in ritual contexts that gave the experience meaning and structure. The result was a relationship with cannabis that was neither addictive escapism nor ignorant indulgence, but something more nuanced, in its own terms, more profound. Ayurvedic medicine and cannabis alongside its role in Hindu spirituality. Cannabis also occupied a central place in Ayurveda, the ancient Indian system of medicine that remains one of the oldest continuously practiced medical traditions in the world. Ayurvedic texts dating back more than 2,000 years describe cannabis in great detail, categorizing its properties according to the elaborate theoretical framework of doshas and gunas that structure Ayurvedic thought. Cannabis was used in Ayurveda to treat an extraordinary range of conditions: digestive disorders, pain and inflammation, anxiety and insomnia, infectious diseases, and neurological complaints. It was administered in multiple forms, as an infused drink, as an edible paste, as a topical application, and as smoke inhaled through a pipe. The Ayurvedic tradition recognized that different preparations of cannabis produced different effects and were appropriate for different conditions and different patient constitutions. A nuanced pharmacological understanding that anticipates modern cannabis medicine by 2 millennia. Chapter 5 The Ancient Middle East and the Mediterranean World. Cannabis in Ancient Egypt. Egypt, one of the most documented civilizations of the ancient world, offers tantalizing but incomplete evidence for cannabis use. Egyptian medical papyri, the ancient world's equivalent of medical textbooks, describe a plant that many scholars have identified as cannabis. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BCE, describes a preparation that may include cannabis applied vaginally to ease childbirth. Other papyri describe preparations for eye conditions and inflammatory diseases that may involve the same plant. The identification of the Egyptian plant name with cannabis is not certain. Ancient botanical nomenclature was imprecise, and the same name sometimes referred to multiple plants. But pollen analysis of Egyptian mummies and of materials found in tombs has identified cannabis in context that suggests deliberate use. In 1992, traces of cannabis were identified in the hair and bones of Ramesses II, one of the most celebrated pharaohs of ancient Egypt, alongside traces of other plant substances. This does not prove that Ramesses himself used cannabis recreationally. The presence of plant residues in ancient bodies can reflect many things, but it confirms the plant was present in the Egyptian world, cannabis in ancient Israel, and the anointing oil of the most provocative and controversial proposals in the scholarship of ancient cannabis use concerns the religion of ancient Israel. In 1980, Polish anthropologist Sula Benate proposed that the Hebrew word cannabis, which appears several times in the Old Testament, referred not to calamus, the plant it had traditionally been identified with, but to cannabis. If Benate's identification is correct, then cannabis may have been an ingredient in the sacred anointing oil described in the Book of Exodus, which was used in the consecration of priests and kings. This proposal has been taken seriously by a number of scholars, though it remains contested. The Hebrew cannabis translates roughly as fragrant cane or aromatic reed, and while calamus remains the most common identification, the linguistic parallels between cannabis and cannabis, both linguistically and through cognate forms in ancient languages, are striking. Subsequent archaeological work in Israel, including the discovery of cannabis residue at a 700-year-old Israelite shrine at Tel Arad in 2020, has added weight to the idea that cannabis played some role in ancient Israelite religious practice, whether or not it was the specific plant referenced in Exodus. The Tel Arad discovery deserves special attention. Researchers analyzing the remains of a ritual altar at this ancient shrine identified cannabis residue containing clear evidence of THC and its degradation products. The cannabis appeared to have been burned on the altar, producing smoke that would have filled the sacred space. This was not domestic use or medicinal use. It was ceremonial, deliberate, and at the very center of an official religious site. The implications for our understanding of ancient Israelite religion are still being debated. Greece, Rome, and the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome knew about cannabis, though their relationship with it was different from the cultures to their east. Herodotus, as we have seen, described Scythian cannabis with a mixture of fascination and mild anthropological condescension as something that the barbarians to the north did. Remarkable and somewhat exotic from a Greek perspective. The Greeks were generally more interested in wine as their intoxicant of choice, and cannabis does not appear in religious practice in the way it does in Indian or Central Asian traditions. Nevertheless, Greek and Roman physicians were well aware of cannabis as a medicinal plant. Dioscorides, the 1st century Greek physician whose De Materia Medica was the standard reference text for European and Islamic medicine for 15 centuries, describes cannabis and its uses in clinical detail. He notes its utility in treating irritants and inflammation and mentions the intoxicating properties of the plant, though he does not recommend these properties for therapeutic use. Galen, the great Roman physician of the 2nd century CE, also describes cannabis and notes that it was customary among wealthy Romans to pass cannabis seeds after dinner to produce hilarity and warmth, an account that sounds remarkably modern in its casualness. What these classical sources tell us is that by the early centuries of the Common Era, cannabis was known across the Mediterranean world as both a useful fiber plant and a substance with psychoactive properties. It was not a secret, not a mystery, and not a substance confined to exotic foreign cultures. It was simply one plant among many, valued for multiple purposes, understood by physicians, and consumed for pleasure by the sophisticated urban elite of the Roman Empire. Chapter 6. The Islamic Golden Age and the spread of cannabis hashish in the Arab world. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE created a vast new cultural and a commercial network stretching from Spain to Central Asia. This network would become one of the primary vectors through which cannabis and its uses spread across the world. The Islamic prohibition on alcohol created both a practical and a moral incentive for the exploration of alternative intoxicants and cannabis, in the form of hashish, the concentrated resin of the plant, became the principal substitute. The word hashish itself is Arabic, derived from the word for grass or dried herb. Its origins as a term, our cannabis resin, are somewhat murky, but by the 11th and 12th centuries, hashish was being widely produced and consumed across the Middle East, North Africa, and Persia. The most famous production centers were in the regions of present-day Lebanon, Egypt, and Afghanistan, areas that have remained associated with high-quality cannabis products to the modern era. The history of hashish in the Islamic world is not a simple story of prohibition and transgression. While Orthodox Islamic jurists debated whether cannabis, like alcohol, was haram, forbidden, the consensus that emerged was complicated and varied by region and school of thought. In Egypt and the Levant, hashish use was widespread across all social classes. In Persia, it was associated with Sufi mystical practice. In some parts of the Islamic world, it was tolerated. In others, it was periodically suppressed. This ambiguity has never been fully resolved, and the legal and moral status of cannabis in Muslim-majority societies remains a contested question to the present day. The Sufis and the mystical dimension within the Sufi tradition. The mystical strand of Islam that emphasizes direct personal experience of the divine through practices like music, poetry, and meditation. Cannabis found its most eloquent advocates. Certain Sufi orders, particularly in Persia and in the regions that are now Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, used hashish as an aid to the states of spiritual absorption known as hal and fana, the dissolution of the self in the divine presence. The great Persian poets of the medieval Islamic world, Rumi, Hafiz Omar Khayyam, wrote in a language saturated with the imagery of wine, intoxication, and altered states, and scholars have long debated the extent to which these images were purely metaphorical or reflected actual experience with substances, including hashish. The answer is probably both. The poetry operates simultaneously on a literal and a metaphorical level, using the language of intoxication to describe states of spiritual ecstasy that the poets understood through both direct experience and philosophical contemplation. The Sufi relationship with cannabis is important for the broader history of the plant, because it represents another sophisticated attempt, like the Hindu tradition, to integrate cannabis into a coherent spiritual practice. The Sufis were not hedonists seeking escape from reality. They were seekers who believed that certain states of altered consciousness could open windows onto a deeper truth. Whether or not one accepts this theological framework, the tradition represents a serious engagement with the effects of cannabis and an attempt to give those effects meaning and purpose within a larger spiritual life. The legend of the assassins. No account of cannabis in the medieval Islamic world would be complete without the story, or the legend, of the assassins. The Hashashin were a secretive Ismaili Muslim sect that operated from mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria during the 11th through 13th centuries CE. They became notorious throughout the medieval world for their practice of targeted political assassination, carried out by young devotees who were, according to legend, motivated by the promise of paradise. The word assassin is widely believed to derive from Hashashin, users of hashish, and the legend that circulated in the medieval period held that the sect's leader, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, used cannabis to induce visions of paradise in his recruits, conditioning them to willingly sacrifice their lives in service of his political agenda. Marco Polo, traveling through the region in the 13th century, gave the most elaborate version of this story, describing a secret garden where recruits were drugged with hashish and transported to what they believed was the paradise promised to the faithful. Modern historians are deeply skeptical of these accounts. The most likely explanation for the Hashashin etymology is that it was a term of contempt applied to the sect by their enemies, meaning rabble or low-class people who smoke hashish, not a literal description of their practices. The elaborate hashish paradise story has the character of propaganda and Orientalist fantasy more than historical fact. But the legend's persistence tells us something important about how cannabis was perceived in the medieval world. It was powerful enough, and its effects dramatic enough, that contemporaries could believe it capable of facilitating extraordinary and extreme behavior. Chapter 7. Cannabis Travels Africa and the New World. The African journey. Cannabis reached sub-Saharan Africa through the same networks of trade and migration that spread so many other technologies and substances across the ancient world. The timing is debated, but most scholars believe that cannabis arrived in East Africa, probably through Arab traders operating along the Swahili coast, sometime between the 1st and 12th centuries of the Common Era. From there, it spread slowly inland and eventually to West Africa, reaching the continent's coast, perhaps by the 15th or 16th century. In Africa, cannabis encountered cultures with their own rich traditions of ritual plant use, and it was absorbed into existing spiritual and medicinal frameworks rather than displacing them. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, cannabis, known by a bewildering variety of local names, most famously daga in southern African languages, became associated with specific cultural practices and social contexts. In some communities, it was used in coming-of-age rituals. In others, it was associated with manual laborers, warriors, and healers. The Zulu, the Southo, and many other southern African peoples incorporated cannabis use into their cultural life in ways that were deeply specific to their own traditions. One of the most significant African cannabis traditions is that of the Bina Riemba, the people of the hemp, a brotherhood that emerged in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo in the 19th century, and used cannabis as a sacrament and a social bond. Members of the Bina Riamba shared cannabis ritually, used it in healing ceremonies, and held it as a symbol of peace and brotherhood. The tradition offers a window into how cannabis could function as a social and spiritual technology, binding communities together around a shared practice. Cannabis and the Atlantic slave trade, the forced migration of millions of Africans to the Americas across the 16th through 19th centuries, was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. It was also, incidentally, one of the primary mechanisms through which cannabis reached the Western Hemisphere. Enslaved Africans brought cannabis with them, or more precisely, they were familiar with the plant and recognized it in the Americas, where Portuguese colonizers had already introduced it to Brazil by the mid-16th century. The role of enslaved Africans in transmitting cannabis culture to the Americas has been documented most thoroughly in Brazil, where the plant acquired the name maconha among communities of African descent. It spread slowly through the rural and urban poor, particularly in the northeast of the country, and maintained strong associations with African Brazilian religious traditions, including candomblé. By the 20th century, cannabis use in Brazil was widespread enough that it would become a major target of prohibition campaigns. Campaigns that, as we shall see, conducted in ways that reflected the racial politics of the era. Cannabis in the pre-Columbian Americas. A question of timing. One of the persistent questions in the history of cannabis is whether the plant reached any part of the Americas before European contact. Some researchers have proposed that cannabis arrived in South America via Polynesian voyagers, who are now known to have made contact with South America before Columbus, or even via an earlier, more speculative route from Asia. The evidence for pre-Columbian cannabis is thin and contested, and the mainstream scholarly view is that cannabis was introduced to the Western Hemisphere by Europeans and, through the slave trade, by Africans. But the question has not been entirely closed. Chapter 8: Cannabis in Early Modern Europe. Hemp empires. The industrial use of cannabis in early modern Europe, the period from roughly the 15th through the 18th centuries. Cannabis was primarily known as hemp, and hemp was one of the most economically important plants on Earth. The sails and rigging of the great ocean-going ships that connected Europe to Asia, Africa, and the Americas were made of hemp fiber. The uniforms of soldiers were often made of hemp cloth. Hemp paper was widely used before wood pulp paper became dominant. Hemp seed oil was used as a lamp fuel, as a food, and in paints and varnishes. This economic importance meant that European powers had powerful incentives to encourage hemp cultivation. England's Henry VIII decreed in 1533 that all landowners must allocate a portion of their land to hemp cultivation. Elizabeth I tightened these requirements. The British Navy's dependence on hemp fiber for its ropes and canvas was so acute that ensuring a reliable supply of hemp was a matter of national security. In all of this, the psychoactive properties of cannabis were well understood but largely beside the point, at least in official European discourse. European physicians had access to the classical texts of Dioscorides and Galen and knew that the plant could affect the mind, but the varieties grown in northern Europe's cooler climate tended to be lower in THC than the cannabis of Central Asia or India. And the primary cultural framework for cannabis in Europe was agricultural and industrial rather than medicinal or spiritual. The Grand Tour and the discovery of hashish, this began to change in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as European travelers, diplomats, soldiers, merchants, scholars, and artists increasingly encountered hashish in the Middle East and North Africa. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign of 798 to 108 Thurid is incited as a pivotal moment. French soldiers in Egypt encountered hashish on a scale they had never experienced at home, and despite official prohibitions issued by Napoleon himself, many of them sampled it. When these soldiers returned to France, they brought with them both experience with and curiosity about the substance. French physicians, who were in the midst of a golden age of pharmacological experimentation, became interested in cannabis as a potential medicine. The Irish physician William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, working in British India in the 1830s, conducted the first clinical trials of cannabis as a medicine in the Western tradition, testing it on patients with tetanus, rabies, cholera, and rheumatism, and reporting promising results. His work introduced medical cannabis to Victorian Britain and, through the reach of British medicine, to the wider Western world. The Club des Hachiciens in Paris in the 1840s, a group of French intellectuals and writers formed what they called the Club des Hachiciens, the Club of the Hashish Eaters, meeting regularly at the Hotel Pimodan on the Ile Saint-Louis. The club's members consumed substantial doses of a cannabis preparation and recorded their experiences in vivid detail. The club's members included Théophile Gautier, Charles Baudelaire, Gérard de Nerval, and Alexandre Dumas, some of the most celebrated literary figures of 19th century France. The writings that emerged from these experiments represent the first sustained attempt in the Western literary tradition to describe the cannabis experience from the inside. Baudelaire's essay Les Paradis Artificiels, Artificial Paradises, is probably the most famous product of this tradition. A meticulous, sometimes rapturous, sometimes appalled account of what it feels like to be under the influence of hashish, examined through the lens of a mind simultaneously experiencing and analyzing its own altered state. These texts were not advocacy documents. Baudelaire in particular was ambivalent about the experience he described. But they were honest, they were taken seriously, and they established cannabis as a subject worthy of literary and philosophical attention in the Western intellectual tradition. Chapter 9. The modern era begins. Cannabis in the Americas, Mexico, the border, and the birth of reefer, the United States, which would become the epicenter of global cannabis prohibition in the 20th century, had a long and relatively untroubled history with the hemp plant before the modern era. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson grew hemp. Hemp was a common crop across the American colonies and the early republic, valued for its fiber, seeds. The word marijuana had not yet entered the American vocabulary. Cannabis as a smoked intoxicant entered the American cultural consciousness, and the Caribbean. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the practice of smoking cannabis spread northward from Mexico with migrant workers, and was also introduced by Caribbean sailors and musicians, particularly in port cities like New Orleans. In these communities, cannabis was known by its Spanish name, marijuana or marijuana, a word of disputed etymology that may derive from Mexican Spanish slang or may have Portuguese roots. The association of cannabis with Mexican immigrants and with black communities in the American South was not incidental to the politics of prohibition that followed. Early anti-cannabis campaigns in the United States were frequently and openly racist in their rhetoric, portraying marijuana as a dangerous foreign substance that corrupted the morals of white Americans, and that was particularly associated with communities of color. This racist framing was not a secondary feature of American drug policy. It was, as historians have demonstrated, one of its primary engines. Harry Anslinger and the machinery of prohibition. The man most responsible for the criminalization of cannabis in the United States was Harry J. Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, appointed in 1930. Anslinger was a skilled bureaucrat and political operator who recognized that cannabis prohibition offered an opportunity to expand the power and budget of his agency. He conducted a public relations campaign against marijuana that was, by modern standards, extraordinary in its dishonesty and its explicit racism. Anslinger's claims about marijuana were not supported by the scientific evidence available at the time. He characterized cannabis as a violent, addictive drug that caused insanity and murder, describing its users in terms that barely concealed their racial subtext. He lobbied Congress aggressively, and in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act effectively criminalized cannabis at the federal level in the United States. This legislation was passed with minimal debate and over the explicit objection of the American Medical Association, whose representative testified that he had received almost no advance notice of the hearings, and that the association opposed the bill. The 1937 Act did not make marijuana illegal per se. It imposed a tax so prohibitive that legal use was effectively impossible, but its effect was the same. Cannabis, which had been listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia as a legitimate medicine since waned 1850, was effectively eliminated from American medicine and commerce. The plant that had clothed American soldiers in the Revolution and fueled the lamps of American households for generations was now, officially, a dangerous narcotic. Chapter 10. The War on Drugs, its consequence, the 1960s counterculture, and the rediscovery of cannabis. The post-World II United States witnessed a remarkable cultural transformation, and cannabis was at its center. In the 1950s, the Beat Generation, writers and poets like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs had already established cannabis as a symbol of intellectual and artistic rebellion against mainstream American conformity. By the 1960s, this association had spread from bohemian subcultures to the mainstream youth culture of the baby boom generation. The counterculture of the 1960s was many things simultaneously: a political movement against the Vietnam War, a cultural revolution against the values of the post-war establishment, an exploration of expanded consciousness through music, art, and psychedelics. Cannabis was present at every stage of this movement. The Beatles smoked it. Bob Dylan smoked it. Millions of young Americans smoked it for the first time at this moment, and many of them found the experience liberating, pleasurable, and at odds with the terrifying portrait that official propaganda had painted of the drug. This gap between official rhetoric and lived experience was, in retrospect, one of the most significant contributing factors to the erosion of trust between the American government and the generation that came of age in the 1960s, when young people discovered that marijuana was not the violence-inducing, sanity-destroying substance they had been told it was. Many of them drew the logical inference that the government had been lying to them about this, and began to wonder what else they might have been lied to about. Nixon, the Controlled Substances Act, and the origins of the war on drugs, the legal frame that would govern cannabis in the United States for the next 5 decades, was established in 1970 with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act. This legislation, signed by President Richard Nixon, created the scheduling system that categorized drugs according to their perceived danger and medical utility. Cannabis was placed in Schedule I, the most restrictive category reserved for substances deemed to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. The placement of cannabis in Schedule I was explicitly contested at the time. Nixon appointed a commission under Raymond Schaefer to study the question. The Schaefer Commission's in 1972 report concluded that cannabis should not be criminalized and recommended decriminalization for personal use. Nixon rejected the report's recommendations. In 1994, Nixon's domestic policy advisor John Ehrlichman gave an interview that has since become one of the most quoted pieces of evidence about the true motivations behind the war on drugs. Ehrlichman stated that the Nixon administration had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. By associating the left with marijuana and black people with heroin and criminalizing both heavily, they could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Ehrlichman's statement has been disputed by some, but it reflects of the war on drugs that has been supported by considerable historical scholarship. Global prohibition. The single convention and its legacy, the United States, did not criminalize cannabis in isolation. Through its influence on international drug policy, it was instrumental in creating a global framework of cannabis prohibition. The single convention on narcotic drugs, adopted by the United Nations in 1961, required signatory nations to criminalize cannabis, establishing a worldwide system of prohibition that would remain in place, with various modifications, for the rest of the 20th century. The impact of this global prohibition on the countries of the developing world, particularly those in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where cannabis had been cultivated and used for centuries, was severe. Traditional cannabis cultivation and use had been perfectly legal under customary law for generations, became illegal overnight. Not through any democratic process within those countries, but through the imposition of a framework developed in Geneva and Washington. The human cost of this imposition, measured in arrests, imprisonments, and the disruption of traditional communities, has been enormous and has never been fully reckoned. Chapter 11. The Science of Cannabis. What we now know: the endocannabinoid system. A discovery that changed everything, the most important scientific development in the history of cannabis research did not involve the plant itself, but the human body. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, researchers studying how THC affected the brain made a discovery that fundamentally changed our understanding of both cannabis and human physiology. They found that the human brain contains specific receptors for cannabinoids, proteins on the surface of neurons that are specifically shaped to receive THC and related compounds. This system of receptors, along with the naturally occurring molecules that activate them, became known as the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system is not a curiosity. It is a fundamental component of human physiology, involved in regulating a remarkable range of biological processes: appetite and metabolism, pain and inflammation, mood, anxiety, memory and cognition, immune function, reproductive biology, and sleep. The discovery of this system revealed why cannabis has such diverse and powerful effects on the human body. Not because it is a toxic alien substance, but because it interacts with a system that is deeply integrated into the normal functioning of human biology. This discovery also raised a profound question about the history we have been exploring. If the human body has a sophisticated system specifically adapted to respond to plant cannabinoids, what does that tell us about the ancient relationship between our species and this plant? The most likely answer is not that the endocannabinoid system evolved in order to allow humans to get high on cannabis. Rather, the system evolved for its own internal regulatory purposes and cannabis. Through millions of years of its own evolution, independently developed molecules that happen to activate the same receptors. But the practical result is the same. Humans and all vertebrates are profoundly responsive to cannabis in ways that appear to be hardwired into our biology. The medical evidence, pain, epilepsy, and beyond, as prohibition gradually relaxed in some jurisdictions in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Medical researchers were able to study cannabis more systematically than had been possible during the peak years of prohibition. The results have been significant, though they require careful interpretation. The strongest evidence for medical cannabis involves a small number of specific conditions. Cannabidiol, CBD, a non-psychoactive cannabinoid, has been demonstrated in rigorous clinical trials to reduce the frequency and severity of seizures in certain forms of childhood epilepsy that are resistant to conventional treatment. This finding was so compelling that it led to the approval of a CBD-based medicine by the United States Food and Drug Administration in 2018, the first cannabis-derived medicine to receive such approval in the modern era. For pain management, the evidence is more complex. Multiple studies have found that cannabis and cannabinoids are effective for certain types of chronic pain, particularly neuropathic pain and pain associated with multiple sclerosis. The evidence is less clear for other types of pain. What is notable is that cannabis appears to be relatively safe compared to the opioid medications that have caused an epidemic of addiction and overdose deaths in the United States and elsewhere. A comparison that has become increasingly important to the debate over medical cannabis policy. The risks of cannabis use are real and should not be minimized. Heavy, long-term use is associated with an increase of osmosis in individuals with genetic vulnerability to mental illness. Adolescent cannabis use is associated with cognitive effects that may persist into adulthood. Cannabis used during pregnancy carries risks to fetal development. And while cannabis is far less addictive than alcohol, opioids, or nicotine, a significant minority of regular users do develop a form of cannabis use disorder characterized by dependence and withdrawal symptoms. These are legitimate public health concerns that deserve serious attention. Chapter 12 of The Age of Legalization, The Turn of the Tide. The global consensus on cannabis prohibition that had held since the 1960s began to crack in the 1990s, first in the United States, and then in other parts of the world. California became the first American state to legalize medical cannabis in 1996, following a ballot initiative that passed over the opposition of both major political parties and the federal government. Other states followed, and by the early 21st century, a majority of American states had some form of medical cannabis law on their books. The shift toward full recreational legalization came more slowly, but when it came quickly. Colorado and Washington State voted to legalize recreational cannabis in 2012, the first jurisdictions in the modern world to do so. Norway became the first country to fully legalize cannabis nationally in 2013. Canada followed in 2018, becoming the first G7 nation to legalize recreational cannabis nationally. As of the mid-2020s, a majority of Americans live in states where recreational cannabis is legal. And a growing number of countries around the world have moved toward various forms of decriminalization or legalization. The arguments for legalization have generally focused on several distinct but interconnected themes. the failure of prohibition to reduce cannabis use, the enormous social cost of mass incarceration for cannabis offenses, a cost borne proportionately by communities of color, the potential tax revenue from legal cannabis sales, and the adults should have the right to make their own decisions about substances that are less harmful than alcohol and tobacco. The cannabis industry and its contradictions, the legalization of cannabis in various jurisdictions has created a new industry of enormous scale and complexity. Legal cannabis sales in the United States alone were estimated in the billions of dollars annually by the early 2020s, with hundreds of companies involved in cultivation, processing, retail, and the development of new products ranging from vape cartridges to edibles to CBD-infused cosmetics. This industry has brought cannabis out of the underground economy and into the mainstream capitalist commerce in ways that have been both celebrated and criticized. The social justice implications of cannabis legalization have been more complicated than advocates hoped. While legalization reduced the number of arrests for cannabis possession in jurisdictions where it has been implemented, the communities that were most harmed by the war on drugs have not automatically benefited from legalization. The legal cannabis industry is overwhelmingly white-owned, and the barriers to entry, expensive licenses, strict regulatory requirements, the need for substantial startup capital, have effectively excluded many of the people from communities of color who were most harmed by prohibition. Some advocates have called for criminal record expungement and equity programs, necessary complements to legalization. The extent to which such programs have actually been implemented varies widely. Cannabis and the global South today, as the United States and other wealthy nations move toward legalization. The situation in many parts of the global South remained markedly different. In Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, cannabis prohibition continued to be enforced with a severity that increasingly appeared disproportionate and politically motivated. The Philippines under President Rodrigo Duterte launched a particularly brutal crackdown on drugsers that resulted in thousands of extrajudicial killings. In Thailand, by contrast, the government moved toward legalization in 2022, in a startling reversal of decades of harsh policy. The contrast between the treatment of cannabis users in rich nations moving toward legalization and those in poor nations still subject to harsh prohibition has become one of the central moral arguments in the global drug policy debate. It raises questions about the equity of a global prohibition regime that's originally imposed by wealthy Western nations, and that continues to be enforced most brutally in the countries that had the least say in its creation. Chapter 13. Cannabis and Culture, Art, Music, and Society. The muse and the plant throughout its history, cannabis has maintained a close association with artistic creativity and cultural production. This association is not merely anecdotal. The altered states of perception, the loosening of habitual patterns of thought, the heightened sensitivity to sensory experience. All of these effects of cannabis have been credited by generations of artists, musicians, and writers with facilitating the creative process. Whether this is a pharmacological reality or a cultural myth is a question that researchers have not definitively answered. But the cultural reality of the association is beyond dispute. The relationship between cannabis and jazz is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of this phenomenon. In the early 20th century, cannabis, known in jazz circles as reefer, muggles, or tea, was deeply embedded in the culture of African American jazz musicians. Louis Armstrong smoked cannabis throughout his adult life and was a vocal advocate for its decriminalization. Cab Calloway wrote the song Reefer Man. Numerous songs era reference cannabis in terms that range from playful to celebratory. The relationship between cannabis and jazz was not merely recreational. Musicians described cannabis as enhancing their ability to hear and respond to what other players were doing, deepening their engagement with the music, and opening up creative possibilities that felt unavailable in a straight state. Whether these accounts reflect a genuine pharmacological reality or a culturally conditioned expectation, they are consistent enough across enough musicians to constitute a meaningful body of testimony. Reggae, Rastafari, and ganja a sacrament. Perhaps no musical tradition is more thoroughly identified with cannabis than reggae. And no religious tradition in the modern world has a more explicit and theologically developed relationship with the plant than Rastafarianism. The Rastafari movement emerged in Jamaica in 1930s, drawing on elements of Christianity, Pan-African politics, and a profound reverence for the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie. Central to Rastafari practice is the ritual use of cannabis, called ganja or the herb, which is treated not as a recreational drug, but as a holy sacrament, a means of achieving spiritual clarity and communion with the divine. The theological framework of Rastafari cannabis use draws on the biblical text, with Rastafari theologians citing passages from Genesis, Psalms, and Revelation as evidence that the herb is a divine gift. The ritual context of Rastafari cannabis use, known as reasoning sessions, during which participants discuss spiritual, social questions while smoking, is a sophisticated example of the same pattern we have seen across cultures and centuries. The use of cannabis as a facilitator of spiritual insight and communal connection rather than as mere entertainment. Reggae music, which emerged from and remained deeply embedded in Rastafari culture, carried this tradition to a global audience. Bob Marley, the most celebrated reggae artist in history, was a committed Rastafari whose music and public persona made cannabis more visible on the world stage than any other cultural figure of the 20th century. Through reggae, the spiritual and political dimensions of cannabis use, its association with resistance to oppression, with African identity, with spiritual seeking, reached audiences in every country on earth. Cannabis in the modern cultural mainstream. By the early 21st century, cannabis had moved from marker of countercultural identity to something far mainstream. Cannabis references permeated popular music, film, and television in ways that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre tradition of West Coast hip-hop had made cannabis use explicitly central to an enormously popular and commercially successful cultural product. The Judd Apatow school of stoner comedy had made the cannabis-using protagonist a familiar and sympathetic figure in mainstream American cinema. This cultural mainstreaming of cannabis was both a cause and an effect of the polyglot shift toward legalization. As representations of cannabis in popular culture became more normalized and less stigmatized, public opinion shifted. And as public opinion shifted, politicians found it increasingly possible and eventually necessary to support legalization. The cultural and political histories of cannabis in the 21st century are inseparable. Chapter 14: The Genetic History. What DNA tells us sequencing the cannabis genome in recent decades. Advances in genetics have opened new windows onto the history of cannabis that complement and sometimes contradict the archaeological and historical record. The sequencing of the cannabis genome and the application of population genetics to the analysis of existing cannabis varieties has allowed researchers to trace the evolutionary and agricultural history of the plant with a precision that would have been impossible even 20 years ago. A landmark study published in 2020-21 used genomic analysis of hundreds of cannabis samples from around the world to map the plant's evolutionary history. The findings were significant. They confirmed that cannabis was first domesticated in East Asia, specifically in the region of present-day China, approximately 12,000 years ago, placing cannabis domestication at or near the very beginning of the Neolithic agricultural revolution. The study identified a single ancestral gene pool from which all domesticated cannabis varieties descended, and traced the subsequent divergence of hemp varieties, grown primarily for fiber and seed, from drug varieties, grown for their psychoactive resin. The genetic evidence suggests that the split between hemp and drug cannabis is ancient, perhaps as old as the domestication itself, or at least several thousand years old. This supports the hypothesis that humans recognized the psychoactive properties of cannabis very early in their relationship with the plant and began selecting for those properties in certain cultivation lines. In other words, the distinction between industrial hemp and psychoactive cannabis is not a modern invention. It is as old as cannabis agriculture itself. Migration and genetic diversity. The population genetics of cannabis also tells a story of human migration. As the cannabis genome study traced the spread of the plant from its Central Asian homeland, it found signatures of the human migrations that carried it. Cannabis moved along the Silk Road with Central Asian traders. It moved into South Asia with the Indo-Aryan migrations that contributed to the development of the Vedic civilization. It moved into the Middle East and North Africa with the expansion of Islamic trade networks. And it moved to the Americas with European colonizers and African enslaved people. Each of these migrations a distinct genetic signature in the cannabis varieties associated with different world regions. The land races, the traditional, locally adapted cannabis varieties that developed over centuries in different parts of the world, are the living genetic record of this history. The famous Acapulco gold of Mexico, the Hindu Kush strains of Afghanistan, the Durban poison of South Africa. Each represents a distinct genetic line shaped by centuries of local cultivation, local climate, and local cultural practices. This genetic heritage is now under threat. The industrialization of cannabis production under legalization, with its emphasis on standardized, high-THC varieties selected for commercial appeal, has created pressure toward genetic homogenization that could result in the loss of thousands of years of botanical history. Efforts to preserve cannabis landrace genetics have become a serious concern within both the scientific and the cannabis cultivation communities. Chapter 15. The future of cannabis medicine, policy, and the road ahead. Standing at the present moment. In the mid-2020s, it is possible to see with some clarity how the history of cannabis has shaped the world we now inhabit, and to make reasonable inferences about where the story might go. Next. The age of global cannabis prohibition, which lasted roughly from the 1930s to the 2010s, is clearly drawing to a close, though the pace and extent of that transition remains uneven and contested. In medicine, the rediscovery of cannabis as a legitimate therapeutic tool is well underway. The approval of CBD for epilepsy treatment was a watershed moment, and research into the therapeutic potential of THC, CBD, and the dozens of other cannabinoids in the plant continues to accelerate. The legalization of cannabis research in jurisdictions that previously made such research effectively impossible has begun to produce results, and the next decade is likely to see significant advances in our understanding of how cannabis can be used to treat conditions ranging from chronic pain to post-traumatic stress disorder to inflammatory diseases. In policy, the direction of travel is clear, even if the destination remains uncertain. The failure of prohibition, measured in terms of its inability to reduce cannabis use, its enormous financial cost, and the social harm inflicted by mass incarceration, has become part of the mainstream political conversation in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The question is no longer whether cannabis will eventually be legal in most of the world, but how quickly, in what form, and under what regulatory framework. The unanswered questions, despite everything we know, there are still fundamental questions about the history of cannabis that remain unanswered. We do not know exactly when the first human consciously and intentionally used cannabis for its psychoactive effects. The archaeological record gives us a lower bound. We know it was happening by at least 2,700 years ago, and probably much earlier. But the first encounter could in 10,000 years ago, or 20,000, or further back still. We simply do not know, and we may never know. We do not fully understand the mechanisms by which cannabis affects consciousness and creativity. The endocannabinoid system is well described at a molecular level, but the relationship between receptor activation and the subjective experience of being high remains one of the great puzzles of neuroscience. Why does cannabis sometimes enhance creativity and sometimes impair it? Why do some people find it relaxing while others find it anxiogenic? Why does the same dose of the same strain produce completely different effects on different occasions? These questions remain open, and we do not yet know the full extent of the social and public health effects of legalization. The legal cannabis experiment is still young, and the data on its effects, on use rates, on public health outcomes, on criminal justice, on social equity, is only beginning to accumulate. The next generation of researchers will have the opportunity to study these questions in a way that simply has not been possible before. And their findings will shape policy discussions for decades to come. A plant, a species, a relationship. This story, the story of when humans first smoked cannabis, and everything that has followed from that first encounter, is ultimately a story about the relationship between our species and the natural world. Humans have always used plants to heal ourselves, to feed ourselves, to clothe ourselves, to build our houses, to reach our gods. The plants we have chosen to cultivate, to revere, to fear, to prohibit, and to celebrate tell us as much about ourselves as they do about botany. Cannabis is a particularly revealing case, because the story of its use spans so many cultures, so many centuries, and so many different human contexts. In some times and places, it has been a sacrament. In others, a medicine. In others, an agricultural commodity. In others, a symbol of political rebellion. In others, an excuse for repression and mass incarceration. The plant itself has remained essentially the same throughout, the same molecules, the same receptors, the same altered state of consciousness. What has changed is the human framework which that experience has been understood, controlled, and contested. The question of when humans first smoked cannabis is, in the end, a question about the beginning of this relationship. A beginning lost in the depths of prehistoric time, recoverable only in fragments and probabilities. What we can say with confidence is that the relationship is ancient, that it has been a constant thread running through the history of human civilization on every inhabited continent, and that it is far from over. The plant and the primate are still in conversation, still working out the terms of a relationship that began, most likely, in the windswept grasslands of Central Asia, before history, before writing, before any of the categories we use to make sense of the human story had yet been invented. It is that will continue. Epilogue. The long memory of plants somewhere in Central Asia On a slope of mountain step above the tree line, a cannabis plant is growing right now. No one cultivated it. No one selected its genetics or optimized it for yield or potency. It grew from a seed, dropped by a bird or carried by the wind, and it is following the same pattern of growth it has followed for thousands of generations, since long before the first human crouched beside a fire and felt something shift in the quality of the air. The plant does not remember us. Plants do not have memory in the way we do. But in a deeper, evolutionary sense, it does carry a record of our relationship in the structure of its molecules, in the specific shape of the cannabinoids it produces, in the way its chemistry has been shaped by thousands of years of human selection. We are written into it. And it is written into us, into the receptors in our brains, into the texts of our oldest scriptures, into the laws that govern our societies, into the art and music and poetry of every culture that has encountered it. That is what it means to be in a relationship that spans 10,000 years. It changes you. It changes what you are on a level deeper than individual memory or conscious intention. Humans and cannabis have been changing each other for as long as there have been humans who cultivated plants. That process is ongoing. It did not begin in the 19th or in ancient China or at the Scythian fire. It began in a moment we cannot see and cannot name, in a time before anyone was recording anything. In the ordinary miraculous encounter between a curious primate and a plant that had something to offer. And whatever we decide to do next, with our laws, our laboratories, our policies, our poetry, we will be doing it within the framework of that ancient and continuing conversation.